Thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction, and thanks for having me here today. And good to be back at this event and see lots of familiar faces from previous years. I think we got lucky with what Facebook did last week, so that'll be a good thing for us to start off by discussing. But first, let me just have the panel quickly introduce themselves. We got a nice combination of political policy and public affairs, or maybe even sort of, I would say there's political and normal people, along with the non-normal people. So introduce yourself first, Tyler.
Sure. Tyler Brown. I guess I was formerly political and now I'm normal. I was a political hack for years, touching all the bases in politics from field work, digital, communications. Most recently was at the Republican National Committee from 2009 through 2016 cycle, the director of digital strategy. I now have my own firm, which focuses on helping organizations build digital into their goals and just focusing and trying to take the complicated and make it simple.
Good morning. I'm Caitlin Donahue. I'm at a small firm. I've never been on the political side, so I guess that makes me always normal. I am the Senior Vice President at Curly Company and Head of Digital. I came from the trade association corporate side, and about 3 years ago made the transition over to the agency side, and have spent the last 3 years desperately trying to convince trade associations and organizations that they need to spend more money in digital. We'll talk a little bit about that today.
Hey, I'm Thomas Riker. I'm the Deputy Digital Director at the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Before that, I was just on the campaign trail for 2 cycles, in 2016 as the Digital Director for Senator Kelly Ayotte's re-election race, and in 2014 on the comms team for Senator Dan Sullivan in Alaska. And then prior to that, I was at the NRCC and the Alaska legislature, so I've sort of seen from the state level all the way to the committee level how the shift towards digital, and in particular towards social media as a primary platform to talk to voters has really grown. So excited to get into that today.
Hey guys, I'm Cooper Reeves. I come from the paid world, companies like Target Victory, the RNC with this fine gentleman at the end, and most recently at America Rising, a super PAC and opposition research firm, as the digital director. And now I'm the digital director at the office of Senator John McCain in the Senate, just a couple blocks from here. I'm organic now. I kind of had to transition from paid world to organic world, thanks to Senate ethics rules that don't allow much in the way of spending. I'm sure you guys might have seen that, or are aware of that. So I'll be able to talk a lot about our organic marketing strategies and how that has dovetailed with paid in the past.
Great, excellent. Thomas, let me start with you, since you're now still the most in the political world of the rest of our panelists. And those of you should know that political hack, that's a term of endearment among all of us. That was not critical at all. You obviously knew some changes were coming with Facebook, and there's certainly more changes to come with Facebook, also on other aspects of their paid side. When you walked into your office last week, and then Mark Zuckerberg made the announcement, what exactly are you not going to be able to do that you thought you would be able to do, if anything, or was it a lot of sizzle?
So I do think that it's going to impact our advertising strategy, just in the sense that obviously video is going to be de-emphasized. And I think one of the major conversations in the digital sphere in 2016 was the rise of video, and that was like that. High-res, high-impact, unskippable video was hands down like the most important, eyeballs that you could get online. And so, to the extent that Facebook is going to de-emphasize that option, I do think that, there's still a core component of our online advertising strategy that is just putting your TV ads on the internet. And I think that increasingly Facebook is not the platform you'd want to pursue to do that. And so I do think it's going to adjust our spend. I don't know that we'll ultimately end up spending less with Facebook. It'll just be on different content, things that feel more organic. We'll probably ramp up display there and potentially ramp it down on other platforms where we do still have the option to expand our video spending. But honestly, campaigns that are doing it right are already producing on a regular basis the kind of content that Facebook is saying that it wants to emphasize here. So if you are a first-person brand, whether that's a candidate or a sitting office holder, the best practice is already for you to be consistently pushing out stuff that, one, optimizes to engagement, and two, is you talking to real people as a real person. And I think to the extent that that's the kind of content that they want to optimize here, it's not really going to impact our campaigns strategies at all. As a third-party publisher, as the NRSC, I'm much less concerned about these changes and much more, not concerned, but the bigger thing that we have to grapple with is the changes announced earlier this year to the way that you can style content that you're putting out from your website. So, it's not that we would ever try to mislead anyone as to where the content's coming from or what it's going to say once you click through the headline. But obviously, we tested a ton of different creative and optimized to whatever was going to get the most engagement. That is much, much harder to do now, given that they've changed the way the back end works. And so I actually think the change in the ability to customize easily the pull-through photo and the headline is going to have a much larger impact on our organization than the changes that were announced last week.
So I see Cooper shaking his head yes. For the old guy on the panel, who's me, explain, and maybe there's other old guys here, what exactly does that mean? So lots of testing, and I think the RNC and the Trump campaign did a lot more testing of this than any of us realized in 2016, and that story is even just starting to be told now. What are some of the things you learned that you may not be able to do now, even with the caveat that the world may not have completely changed like Thomas was describing?
Right. Well, there's a couple things. The most recent part Thomas was talking about, being able to change your photo, your headline, your description and stuff. That has been probably the biggest change for us, even bigger than the algorithm change last week, because I went from being able to change photos, change headlines, change everything, to one day being locked out of doing most of that unless you go through a third-party platform like Sprout Social or something like that, So it makes things a little bit more difficult. Like, for example, if I'm trying to repurpose this is, you guys are gonna ding me for this, but repurpose a press release, for Facebook content, which is terrible, but sometimes these are the things you have to do when you're in the Senate, So the pull-through photo would just be this awful, terrible photo. We can change those now, but the pull-through headline is something that says like press release, : ... and no one's gonna read that. So being able to change those things is gonna be really important. A couple other things Thomas was talking about. What was it? You talked about the algorithm change. That's right. So I think people are kind of scared about this, and I would be scared if I was a news publisher or another kind of publisher. But for political stuff, our content is, by its nature, it invites questions, it invites comments, it invites controversy even. So I think we'll be good. Facebook's new algorithm changes are emphasizing longer comments versus shorter comments. They're emphasizing things that create questions and create controversy even. So I think for political stuff, I feel like my messages are going to stay pretty much the same. Maybe I'll change a few things like asking questions in the actual copy, maybe inviting comments or inviting feedback rather than just expecting feedback like we normally do. So that's sort of where I land on this.
Caitlin, who's not completely normal because you're in Washington, D.C., right, and still in the public affairs world, let me ask that same question to you. How have these changes influenced what you might tell a public affairs client, or maybe it hasn't?
Sure. It has and it hasn't. So as I was saying to you earlier, I think one of the biggest challenges already is having to convince clients to put their money in digital. And so many, I think that this is an area where arguably candidates in politics has been ahead of the curve in terms of advocacy and public affairs, and that there's large trade associations, very significant organizations with a DC and a state footprint who are still very hesitant to get into the digital space. They would still rather have a full page ad in a print newspaper or a TV ad, and that's not to say that one is better than the other, but digital is a core component of any sort of advocacy public affairs strategy. So this comes down to a lot of education. We have already been trying to educate clients, and these are clients who this isn't their full-time job. I'm sitting here in a room full of people who probably know a hell of a lot more about digital than I do. But my job is to take what you all know and bring that back to them and say, this is what you need to be doing. So in that sense, the education continues. In another sense, it makes our job easier. Because at the end of the day, you need an expert to be able to help you navigate. No regular person out there is really able to figure out on a daily basis. Every single time we run a Facebook campaign, there's something new that's changed. And fortunately, the clients are sort of blind to that. But at the end of the day, it's always been an issue about quality versus quantity. And I still have clients who, with a small, meager budget, are like, I want PETA style, P-E-T-A. I want PETA level engagement, or I want PETA level numbers. But the reality is that we're going to be focusing a lot more on the quality of the engagement as well as the type of engagement as opposed to the numbers. So I think what's going to be curious is as we're getting even new clients who want to grow their following, watching those numbers to see are we going to be able to get the significant growth that clients are accustomed to and that they want, because everyone wants to be able to measure against one another, and are we going to be able to effectively convince them that a couple of key quality engagements is actually worth a whole lot more and going to benefit their social channels.
And if I can just reinforce that a little bit,
Yeah.
the only two industry groups or trade associations that we saw pop in the verbatims in polling last cycle were AARP and Association of Builders and Contractors, both of whom tie all of their online advertising to very significant social engagement. And I personally think had they not been reinforcing their high-res paid content with a consistent stream of social media organic content, they wouldn't have popped in the polling.
I want to get back to that point in a second, but I want to turn to Tyler here, because in your, I think in your introduction you said, helping clients, navigate digital or understanding how it fits into everything else. And I've been doing these panels for a while, and so I'm now with the group who has always been in politics when digital has existed. And Caitlin talked a little bit also about convincing people to do digital. I would always joke in Washington, D.C., people not in Washington, D.C. would ask me, could I have Democrats and Republicans over for dinner? And I said, yeah, absolutely. I just can't have broadcast, cable, and digital people selling over to dinner together, and that's when things would get really ugly. With both some of the substance and some of the noise coming out of 2016, one of the ironies that occurred to me is maybe it's an easier argument for someone like you or someone like Thomas in a political campaign, an election campaign, to make an argument for the S word, which everyone in this room cares about, of share going to digital. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I think it's undeniable, and I think this was the case beforehand, but I think for people, the non-believers out there, the impact that digital has on can have on campaigns, issue campaigns, political campaigns. I mean, it's simply a fact that the internet has become the primary source where people are digesting information, sharing information, and going to seek out information. I think in terms of making that sell, one of the biggest problems that comes in digital is making that straight line sell that you should be doing more digital, you should be investing larger share towards digital. And I think partially that's really the wrong sell. I mean, we were talking earlier about engagement and real people versus some of the vanity metrics. I mean, I kid around sometimes, but online people are people too. I think we often tend to distinguish. It's okay, let's say in the case of a political campaign, the field team is out there knocking on doors, dropping lit, signing up volunteers, and then the digital portion says, hey, we've got 1 million users, or we got all these views, and they're great. Digital is only useful insofar as that you are having online action convert into offline action, something that's tangible. And I think it's a matter of going back to the organization and saying, what are your organizational goals? Is it to grow your membership? Is it to push a particular issue or advocacy? Is it fundraising? And start looking at it in those more traditional contexts and saying, okay, this is not an issue of doing more digital for the sake of looking smarter. It's more about how are you actually driving your goals. And for each successful organizations, a larger share of their organizational goals are being achieved online.
So great, but let me push back on that a little bit. Not necessarily disagree with you, but in reality, the lion's share of money will again get spent on television in 2018. And you talk about how the best campaigns are able to integrate and knock down those silos. but go to Tyler and then maybe to Thomas, who probably deals with this on a more daily basis now. When you're sitting in that budget meeting, there is the TV person and the digital person and the press person and the fundraising person, and the reality is those silos still exist, and they're often not singing from the same message hymnal.
Well, yeah, I mean, so my pushback there would be the structure, the context in which you've laid that out, I think is fundamentally flawed in the sense that, you talk about television, that's a persuasion model, fundraising, that's typically you're talking about email. Or, it could be talking about direct mail or something like that. And then you're putting digital as if it's its own, without defining what the goal of digital is. I don't think the share of budget should be, certainly we'd like to see more, and I'm sure many people who sell products and platforms that help that would like to see more of it. But the goal isn't simply to sell more digital, it's to say, okay, if this isn't a conversation about television, it's a conversation about persuasion, in which case, a lot of it should be going to television. We brought up Facebook earlier and video. Well, maybe, I haven't seen conclusive evidence that Facebook is the best channel for video persuasion. Perhaps you should be using Facebook for engagement or list building, acquisition. And so to make that argument, to grow the larger share of the budget, it's not a matter of saying, hey, let's put more in my pocket and I'll go spend it somewhere. It's, being willing to give up the fight when it comes to a persuasion argument, but when it comes to engagement and going to the political director, who may not even be in that meeting that you're referring to, and saying, I can help get the cost per volunteer or cost per vote down, and let me demonstrate that once you've started to get the internal plumbing shown. Just as an example, so going back to 2016, I give a lot of credit to Chris Carr and Chris Young, the political director and field director for the RNC. They spent a lot of time looking at the psychology of what does it mean to be involved as a volunteer, to be a part of a political campaign, giving of your time. And we realized, the Republican Party, to its credit, realized it was doing it wrong. They were playing a volume game, which is like, here's an Excel sheet, call as many people as you can, tell people to come in and make phone calls until their fingers bleed, and then they're like, I don't want to go back and do that again. And then you go try to find someone else. And the purpose of what they were trying to do, which was build capacity. How do you get people personally invested in the program? So from the digital side, we didn't come in at the last minute and say, hey, we want to spend a lot of money to do that. We were there at the beginning to say, the goal, you have defined the goals. We understand scale, so you understand the psychology. You've built a program about how you want to structure this and how you want people to connect. Digital comes in and says, we think we have some solution that can help you do this on a larger scale.
Thomas, let me ask you the same question, and maybe start with a story long before any of you were in politics. So I think 2004 election, which some of you may remember, right? So George W. Bush and John Kerry. And this textbook story of the Bush campaign sort of delivering a lot of lead on the same target. Right? John Kerry's in West Virginia. They get a reporter to ask him a question about a vote on on funding. That vote is the speech is obviously being videotaped. They're ready to cut the ad. That's when he said, I voted for it before I voted against it. Boom, they cut the ad. And then also, boom, they're able to have a lot of surrogates talking about it. Bush 2004, like Obama 2008 or 2012, had strong figures at the top who were able to get everyone doing the same. Don't disagree with Tyler, that's the way things perhaps should work, but there really are these cultural differences within a campaign. And do you see the ability, I see a lot of money spent on TV, I see an increasing amount spent on digital, I still don't see them in sync all the time.
At the campaign level, I would have to disagree with you and say that that has not been my experience at all, largely because your television firm is going to be your media firm, and so they are going to drive the message, and that does trickle down into online advertising as well. I think that has potential to change because some of the biggest reticence from your TV guys is they don't want to build all the additional creative you need to be active online without making the placement money, right? And they don't have the capacity to place those ads, so you're asking them for additional work that they're not getting paid for, in their mind anyway. And so I do think you're starting to see, because of that, decision makers be more open to running sort of low-res, run and gun, caught in the moment social content as meaningful persuasion advertising online, because you can have a junior staffer with a cell phone capture something that's going to do very well on Facebook, do very well across social media, but even on like YouTube, And it doesn't cost you anything to capture that content. So that conversation could change, but right now I would say that the creative is still very much driven by your television firm. I think that Tyler hit on something really important there, which is there is increasingly, to the extent that there is a difference in those cultures, it is increasingly between understanding paid media as persuasion and understanding paid media as voter contact and organization. And so I think that even if you are a third-party brand or an industry group or whatever, understanding that the average user on social media, when they interact with your content, is thinking of it as if they had put that content out. So like they're thinking of a real first world person with a name and a face sitting down on their phone and typing out this status. And so when people engage with that content, if you will then engage with them at the staff level in a first person voice, pull people into direct messages, give them praise for positive comments, share articles that explain how they're wrong when they say something negative, but all in a first-person voice, people treat that as a first-person interaction. So like that is as powerful, I would argue, to a voter or whoever you're trying to reach with an interest group, as if somebody came to their door, knocked, and had an in-person conversation with them. So I think we have whole field budgets and mail budgets and budgets that have nothing to do with television that are dedicated to that voter contact. And that share that's going to digital has to increase. And we also need significantly more staff resources, obviously, to keep that going.
And just to piggyback on that, and I think you see this a lot, the news coverage from political reporters and political media that are trying to cover and understand how digital was used. I don't think there's anybody would question that there's a lack of understanding from these beat reporters who it's not their beat. I think they cover digital as if it's some dark art. Whereas, I would, in terms of targeting, and I was like, we're really not talking, sophistication-wise, yes, it's happening at a larger scale, and that's what the RNC and Trump campaign were doing in 2016 when they were starting to run hundreds of thousands of variations. But from a strategy perspective, it's really not any different from running a direct mail program where, you're sending direct mail to this zip code, and you're sending, perhaps a different message, tailored message to this zip code. And I think that, people start to get really wrapped up and wound up when they start talking about digital because they're not there isn't that baseline understanding of what's going on. And so, what you were talking about, if Facebook is looking to become more transparent and starting to say, here's how much is being spent on Facebook, which is not always clear now the way, FEC reporting is done, I think there's going to be a misinterpretation that, here's what this campaign spent on television, and then here's what they spent on Facebook, therefore that's all part of one budget, and it's not going to be.
The one thing I would also say on the TV and digital divide is that everybody comes to us at the committee and asks, what percentage of my persuasion budget should I be putting on the internet? Which what they're really saying is what percentage of what would normally be my TV buy should I carve off and put on the internet? And what we're really pushing people to adjust that conversation this cycle because it's not about rote percentages. Like, you should define the goals of a specific ad campaign, and then you should be budgeting based upon your vote goals, or in a non-political environment, based upon the number of people that you want to reach. Like, you know how much it costs to reach that number of people. You know how many times you want them to see your ad on average, and how much it's going to cost to reach that many people that many times. Any network online can tell you that. So then that should be what's defining your budget for an individual ad campaign. Even though it seems like that's a major ask to get people to adjust their thinking, we've actually had more success with that because then it's not about some rote bucket of money. If you only need 30 grand to run X ad on the internet, then you only need 30 grand and the TV guys don't bat an eye. And if you need 1.5 mil, that's a larger conversation that you have before launching that ad campaign, but it's about that specific ad campaign and those specific goals, which is an easier fight to have with your TV guys than just saying, give me 25% of your budget and then leave me alone.
Let me keep going on this a little bit here. And anyone can take the question. If we agree that we should be sort of platform agnostic, right? You're trying to deliver a certain message with a certain goal to a certain amount of people, and you're going to maybe touch certain people in particular ways and sort of touch other people in other ways and then touch other people in all the ways. Do you, as an RNC or as a consultant or in your experience, have the ability to track that, to understand which of your bucket of voters, whether it's broad or very specific from a voter file are getting the different touches?
I'll touch on that a little bit and go into some detail. One of the things that I thought was most impressive coming out of 2016 that the RNC was doing, and this is one of those things that's laying under the, it's not gaining a lot of attention, but I think it's really important fundamentally. And this starts to get, how do different departments or verticals within the organization work together? Ashley Burns, I see in the back there, a strong data guru from the RNC. We made the important point that like these voters that you're referring to, these touches that you're talking to, are running across departments, and so how do you start to sync up the, refer to syncing up the plumbing? In 2014, we were running GOTV, Facebook ads, but we didn't at that point. We kind of ran it late, and we didn't have a great understanding of what was the return on it. How many of, how were numbers moving? By the point we got to 2016, we were working very closely with the data department. We were operating off of the same file that the field team was. We were able to go back. We had a direct goal, so it was kind of a direct response campaign where we were seeing things come in. Sign up, fill out your absentee ballot application, and then we could see. And because we were managing the app, we knew who those people were. And we were talking to the data department, they were telling us, were we seeing those show up, say it was, Wisconsin, were we seeing those show up at the Secretary of State's office? And if they were, okay, they're getting cut off the, the political list, the phone list, and the digital list. We're no longer serving ads to them. And once we started to have that full circuit operating, we were able to go back to Chris Carr, the political director, and say, here's what we're getting on it. This is our cost per filled out absentee ballot. Here's what our cost is for an early vote. And once you actually, you can start to compare those numbers, you start to say, that's when the political director's eyes open up and say, oh, you're saving me money. And they like that versus like, go talk to those online people, the cave dwellers over there. Hopefully they'll come out and vote too. But I'm talking to real people. That's not to say that you should spend all of your money on digital. What we were doing is finding the low-hanging fruit. And I think that that's an important sell to make to the political director is, we're not going to be able to run your whole field program from here, but if I can make it cheaper for you to turn out this, bottom 25% or bottom 15%, you can devote more of your resources on the ones that are going to require a personal, field to door-to-door phone call touch. And I think that's where the integration starts to come together.
And speaking as someone who tried to track it from the outside in 2016, I think the big story that someone like me in the media or an academic missed was everyone was looking at how much more Hillary Clinton was spending on television, right? So the daily graphs and stories of Wisconsin, where she didn't spend anything, but most places where outspending Trump by 2, 3, 4 to 1, even on television, even in the last couple of weeks, and maybe even more than that previously, there was this other stuff going on that we weren't able to track. And also, ironically, because there was very little advertising in a place like Wisconsin, it probably enables you to identify exactly what the effect of your digital was a lot more. Cooper, maybe talking about again, sometimes the silos that are in offices, in a Senate office, in one of the larger, more sophisticated Senate offices. Are you sort of the digital person, over there doing your thing, or is it pretty well integrated with the other sorts of things that are being done in a modern Senate office?
Right. Well, I'm speaking from the Republican side, obviously. I believe the Democrat side has had digital folks in Senate offices for maybe a cycle longer than we have, just because of the nature of the way it's set up. But I came into the office in February of this year, and after the 2016 cycle, and I was the first digital director, digital person in our office. We have groups and gatherings of like the digital folks on the Republican side in the Senate, and there's maybe, I'd say 10, 11 of us maybe, and I think a few of them are also like dual deputy press secretary digital people or whatever. But there's a couple of really strong digital folks, and the infrastructure's been set up in what's called the Senate Republican Conference, which is just a resource that is available for everyone on the Republican side in the Senate. They have a really strong and robust digital presence to help out folks. But to your question, yeah, I guess I'm still considered like the digital guy. Still people oftentimes come and ask me IT questions too, which is a lot of fun. But thought we were done with that a couple of years ago. But it's just the nature of the things. I do sit by the wireless router, so I do flip that on and off every now and then. I sort of take pride in the fact that I'm able to do a bit of digital evangelizing in the Senate, and help other offices and things like that come up to par. One of the biggest challenges I faced when I first started was just literally organizational, setting up content channels. So in typical Senate offices, your message is going to be coming out from either chief of staff or communications director or legislative director, these top 3 positions. And so they will, define the message, push the message out. And so it was about sort of working my way into that process, I'm sure you guys are all kind of familiar with, having to, as, digital as an outsider, kind of working your way into the content management system. But so that's really something that I worked on to start with, having say in the way content is created, the headlines, that we make and stuff. And I think it's reaped a lot of rewards for us, just being able to, maybe not always digital first, but at least digital is at the table, for discussion. So it's been a fun learning experience, I hope, for more than just me, so.
Caitlin, as someone who's in the political world but not the election world, and in various sorts of campaign technologies, we've seen Madison Avenue learning from politics and politics learning from Madison Avenue and back and forth. Where are you learning from? So as you look back, and you're not someone who's involved in election campaigns, but you're involved in campaigns, what are the lessons you've taken from maybe the last cycle or two, and which way do you think the learning or the teaching is? That sounded folksy, right? I'm not running for everything. Always when a politician starts doing like the learning, or start dropping G's, or says folks. That's the other big one. Where are you doing either your teaching or learning in the politics to normal world arrow?
I do a lot of my learning from members of Congress, actually. I spend a lot of my time, unfortunately, as part of being in this realm, your personal and your professional social networks are all sort of blurred together, right? But I follow several members of Congress on Snapchat and Instagram, and am constantly watching the way that they're putting out information, because my clients, of course, are mostly trying to communicate with legislators and to impact and shape policy. And so I very much enjoy actually.
Hold on. We can't hear you. Sorry. We're going to have you use this one. Just use this one for now.
Hi. Did you hear anything I just said?
Actually, this is now working again. So try it. Yeah, here we go. All right.
Great.
There we go.
It's only when you touch it.
I'll like hold it like this. Very much I learned from members of Congress, because not only do I enjoy seeing them in that realm, which Angus King is one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram, if anyone's interested. He comes from the beautiful state of Maine, so he puts a lot of beautiful photos out there.
If you don't follow Steve Daines on Snapchat, you should.
Yes.
Exactly.
But more importantly, the reason why that's so critical is because I can then turn around and use those instances with clients to say, in fact, I know for a fact that Steve Daines was just on Snapchat. So not to say that they necessarily should be using Snapchat, but it's allowing me to take a very boring press release that they normally would have put out and say, actually, you should think about it this way. I mean, I obviously use Twitter, just like everybody else, but I follow a lot of trade associations and thought leaders here in DC. I think that that's actually the next realm of where we are going in terms of personality-based and individual-based preference on these social platforms, is the increasing need for people to raise their own personal thought leadership, whether you be a lobbyist in DC or the head of a trade association or the head of a coalition. And I very much enjoy watching what they're doing, which is often, they're just throwing stuff against the wall and seeing whether or not it sticks. I think Jay Timmons at NAM does a really good job of putting himself out there in terms of, being a modern leader in Washington. And I think there's a couple of trade associations that are doing really a great job as well.
Tom's got a couple questions about video for you, both creation, quality, skippability, and maybe some budget incentives. So everyone talks about targeting, and targeting came to TV in the last couple years. And the people who did it best knew that, okay, we can target this particular people, but we got to have a different message for them. And as you said, people who make TV ads don't like making hundreds of them for a variety of reasons. Yet the speed which you're doing things digitally and your ability to target makes it imperative that you have quick and different sorts of messages for different sorts of people. Can you speak to that a little bit more? Because I know there's, campaigns. Do you have that beautiful 30-second spot and just throw it up there? And the lighting's beautiful and the sound's beautiful. There's certain folks who think that's important to have great control. Or, and again, this is just my understanding of what happened in sort of the Trump campaign, that, I don't know if you were like in the team that went to San Antonio and never came back. Basically, here's a bunch of money, try whatever you want, or whatever the quality was, and see what works. So can you speak to some of those challenges?
Yeah, well, so I think there's two things at play there. One is on the targeting side, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think from a creative standpoint, it's understanding that like the content should match the platform, and I do think that there is increasingly an appetite for that. Again, it comes back to just having the human resources to crank out this much stuff. So forgetting about the testing for a second, because that is definitely an area where the Trump campaign pioneered. But even if you're not going to make 15 pieces of what was one of our core issues in New Hampshire, opioid creative or national security creative, or there was a pipeline that she was against, Kinder Morgan. Even if you're only going to make the one piece of creative for that flight, still, even just making issue-specific creative is obviously a heavy lift, particularly for a television firm. I would just say there's a myriad of like young creatives out there that you can bring onto your team relatively cheaply and with a lot more enthusiasm than you would get from your typical TV vendor who's been making ads for 37 years. So I don't think that that's as much of a challenge as people think it is. I mean, I hired in March of the election year, I hired a guy who was a like part-time wedding videographer who lived in middle of nowhere, New Hampshire, to come onto the team full time. By election day, he'd made like 70 web-specific ads, and I don't think that we worked him to death, that's a relatively easy thing to do with a relatively small team, and I think that increasingly we are seeing people bring on those teams. So I don't think it's as hard as people make it out to be. On the targeting side, I would say that yes, people do target television ads. I think that tends to be much more demographic and much less issue specific than the targeting you see online. So I don't know that I have seen anyone who's running, you definitely will see people partner with somebody like Deep Roots and maybe run one television ad that's specifically to swing women, in a way that feels different but is the same message from another TV ad that's going to just like your broadest audience. But I think it's really online where people are pioneering, speaking to folks, no matter what they look like demographically, based upon the issues that they're modeled to most care about. And there you do need a ton of creative, and it is still an open question mark whether television firms are going to be able to fill that void. I don't think that they are. I think another thing that has to change is candidates have to be comfortable with the idea that it is not our job in politics to tell people what to care about. It is our job to talk to them about where we stand on what they already care about. And that means that sometimes you're going to be talking to two different groups of people, two different ways about two different issues. And obviously there's a lot of sort of scared turtle hesitation to do that. But I think that by 2022, every incumbent who's up for re-election on the Senate side will have already run in an environment in which they had a significant digital footprint. And I think that that has really done a lot of that hard work for us, because you're seeing people continue those conversations and those learnings even when they're out of cycle. So Joni Ernst is a great example of someone who is actively every single day talking to pro-life voters in Iowa on their issues. I think that both of the senators from Louisiana have remained active online since taking office, and in particular, we're really out front on healthcare. So there is an appetite to do that, and once the candidates want to do it, the TV guys have to just get on board. That's really what it comes down to, is like, forget about holding the hand of your media firm, and if you need to, just go around them and actually build buy-in with the principals. That's how things are actually going to change.
I think, Steve, we have a couple other questions.
Well, we need to, I want to make sure that we have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience. Anybody have any questions of the panel? Let me ask the allocation question within the social category. Are we going to see any diversification? Are there any channels other than Facebook that you're looking to spend more in this cycle?
No.
I mean, Facebook is it.
You know, just to elaborate, I mean,
You're making this the last time I'll ask this question.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, you know, I mean, Facebook is the phone book of the internet. You know, it's ubiquitous. Whether you know, there's varying levels of how often people engage with it, but there's nowhere where you can get that kind of match rate where you're taking the list and taking it there. Twitter can't compare with that. Snapchat doesn't have the tools behind it. LinkedIn's not that network, so no.
I mean, even though it's still the same, I mean, you're paying the same people basically. We'll be testing all of our television creative on Instagram this cycle because we found that people interact in those tests the same way they would on Facebook, but it's obviously a much less public, lower stress way to go out and test creative. And then I would also say that you'll see us make a much more significant investment in bumper ads via YouTube. We just did a case study with them in Missouri. One of the core learnings of which was that that's a great way to drive ad recall at a much lower rate. I mean, obviously, that's how they pitch the product, but it was nice to see it reflected in the testing that we did as well.
Maybe elaborate a little bit on that, what the test you did, to the extent you can.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we partnered with YouTube in Missouri to test a branded message with basically all voters outside of Metro Kansas City and St. Louis who were not who weren't modeled as hard Democrat. And basically what we found is that what we were trying to figure out was how many impressions you needed to serve on average in a given flight to really move ad recall and persuasion. And what we found is that you see some lift in ad recall after 3 impressions, but you don't really see significant lift in persuasion until you hit the 5 impression line. And so if you're trying to move both, you might as well just budget for that as your absolute baseline. YouTube would want me to say that these are obviously learnings that are very specific to YouTube and very specific to this audience in Missouri. But that was basically what we set out to find. And ultimately what it came down to is that after you got past the baseline of the 5 impressions, you could continue to drive incremental growth in persuasion just using bumper ads. And they're obviously a much cheaper ad unit. So once you've sort of burned in your message at the base level, you might be able to get additional growth for less money using 6-second bumper ads instead of the traditional 15 or 30.
Ken, panel, I'm sorry we have to wrap, but thank you very much. That was great.